Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Merkley. I'm a director with Aspen Digital. Thanks for joining us today. This session is part of an ongoing series. It's actually one of our last ones on mis and disinformation, hosted by the Aspen Institute in tandem with our Commission on Information Disorder. We have been talking with experts across a variety of fields who are helping us make sense of all the different aspects of this crisis that we're facing. These are designed as a resource both for our commissioners, but also for the broader public. And we really hope that you're enjoying them and that you're getting a lot out of them. We definitely have been, and I'm really grateful to all our participants. Today's a conversation I've really been looking forward to. I'm speaking with two experts in the field of cognitive science to help us understand how the brain responds to false information online, how people interact, and really get into the cognitive science details of this challenge that we're facing. Let me first introduce both of them, and then we'll dive into a conversation. First is Dr. Danielle Polage. She is a cognitive psychologist and professor at Central Washington University. She studied the impacts of false information in digital environments and the effects exposure to repeated lying can have on individuals' beliefs and how they accept those lies as fact. Our second expert is Dr. Babak Hemmatian, a Ph.D. candidate in cognitive science and a second-year master's student in computer science at Brown University. He studies how social narratives form and are negotiated using computational methods, machine learning, and behavioral experiments to test his hypotheses. His research dives into how people communicate, how they find consensus online, and how they interact. So welcome, Danielle and Babak. Hi there. Welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
So we've had a lot of interest in the cognitive science aspects of mis and disinformation, questions from our commissioners and also from the broader community. Specifically, what happens in our brains and to our memories when we are exposed to false information and the kinds of discourse and how that and what kind of tactics make us more vulnerable to its effects. So the question I kind of want to open with for both of you as you've worked in this field, how has this rise of the discourse of mis and disinformation in recent years impacted your work? Has this concern around fake news led to an increase in research and studies? How has it changed the conversation for you? Danielle, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Well, in general, when we're presented with any information, we tend to believe it. So our default is a truth bias. And it works in general pretty well because most of the time people are being honest with us, and most of the time we expect people to be honest with us. And we just don't have the ability to, the time, the means to verify everything we hear. So it's a really efficient form of communication. And this impacts how we believe news, whether it's truthful or whether it's not truthful, is because we do have a tendency to believe things that are told to us. And in addition to generally believing new information to be the truth, the illusory truth effect is the tendency to increase the belief in statements based on repetition. So not only is new information typically perceived to be true, but it becomes more and more true to us the more times we hear it. And this effect was first observed, Hasher et al. In 1977. They gave them a bunch of statements on a variety of topics, politics, sports, all different statements that were plausible, but they were things that would be unknown to your average college student who was the participant in the study. And some of them were repeated up to 3 times over 2 weeks, and others weren't repeated. And regardless of whether they were true or not, repeating them made them more true. And this effect has been repeated in a variety of contexts. And it plays a significant role in disinformation and fake news. So most information in the news you would assume to be new to most listeners. That's why they call it the news, right? So people don't really have a lot of firsthand knowledge about what's happening in politics. They don't really know what's happening in the world around them other than what they hear. And even so-called conspiracy theories, a lot of them are plausible. So our job then is to decide whether or not what we're being told is true. And as I just mentioned, typically if we hear it and it's repeated, we assume it to be true. And in 2012, I ran, I think it was the first study looking at the effects of repetition on fake news. And I just made up several news stories, things like a cruise ship had crashed off the coast of California where I was currently living. And then I included the true news stories, a bunch of fake ones. Some of the true ones would be things like benefits of green tea. And over time, people just rated the lie, the made up stories as more truthful, more plausible by me saying to them one time. So not only did they believe in this false information, but then they actually thought they had heard it from other places. So they thought that it had been repeated. They thought it had been verified by multiple sources, but we made it up. More recently, Pennycook, Cannon, and Rand, I think in 2018, they used fake news headlines. They posted them on Facebook, and within a single exposure, people were believing that these false news were more likely to be true. So there's a lot of impact in the memory research looking at just hearing things. You're likely to believe them. And if we don't have the resources, I can talk a little more if you want later about sources, and when you don't have knowledge about a topic, we rely on the source, and we assume that's how most of our education system works. I tell my students stuff, they think I'm telling them information, and it becomes part of their belief system. And that's what's happening in the news. And what ends up happening is we have to look at the source of the material, but a lot of people don't know how to evaluate source. We don't have the ability really to decide if the source is true. And we've also had a decrease in the believability of our sources. A lot of people believe news, a lot of people don't believe the government. So when you don't have direct information, that's all we have. So it's a very difficult situation we're in because people don't know where else to get the information from. And if it doesn't agree with what they believe in, they're not going to listen to it. So,
well, let me. There are so many things in there that I want to unpack with you, but I also want to hear from Babak. So, let me just let's come back to that earlier question about the. Danielle, you cited so much research that goes back before the time when disinformation was a word we all used. Babak, how have you seen that shift as disinformation has come to intersect with a field that has actually been studying this kind of cognitive science for a very, very long time? Illusory truth effect is what, 1977, right? So we've had these concepts for decades, but disinformation is changing them. Have you seen a shift as you've come into this work and done your own work?
Yeah, definitely. I think on one hand, there has been increased interest in studying them, but also I would say the impact of these effects has become greater because a lot of the social media that we use are designed to essentially prey upon these cognitive features that have been extracted through cognitive research to make people more engaged. Now, that can be in service of good, but that can also be in service of evil things. And, that it can help the spread of misinformation. And I would say, personally, I think if I were to summarize the decades of cognitive research in one key takeaway, it would be that we are simultaneously incredible and very limited. We have as humans, we have incredible attention and sensitivity to tiny sources of information in our environment, but at the same time, our ability to incorporate a lot of information into our decisions is limited. And this is what misinformation and disinformation is particularly effective at exploiting, because they can use cues that are usually in our minds are wired to associate them with important information. They use those cues to make us pay attention. And then they provide the kind of simple and easy answers that our brains like to base their decisions on, which then easily propagate. So I think part of the difference that social media have made is making it easier for these effects to happen. But at the same time, they've also made it easier for us as researchers to study them. So hopefully that can help.
That's good. And I'm going to ask you about some of that research in a few minutes. Danielle, I want to go to some of your research first. In your 2017 paper, Liar, Liar, Consistent Lying Decreases the Belief in Truth, I really liked the title of that. You studied how lies affect the liars themselves, the ways that telling the lies changes how we perceive the truth. I want to give you a second to just talk about that, because it feels like we're seeing some of that, the way that people become the tellers of lies and then they become the purveyors of those lies which they now believe. So you open saying that people tend to believe what they find as truth, but you also open that paper with the sentence, "The average person lies about once a day." And so why do we all lie so much, and how does it become truth in our minds? Just could you walk us through how that happens?
Well, if you think about the content of what we're saying, actually lying once a day probably isn't very, very much. That's of course, the average. I mean, is a huge span. There are some people who barely lie at all. There'll be a fraction of a point there. And then there's, people who lie a lot. And I think for people who lie a lot, I think the people around them might start to pick up on that and might discredit that person as a source. So when they're hearing lies from someone, we all have that friend who, we hear a story from them and we think, oh, well, I'm sure it wasn't true the way it happened, or you have some kind of, lack of credibility. So I think in terms of hearing lies, I think the source, ultimately, I think this all comes down to source monitoring. And basically we have cues that we can pick up from external information. We also have cues we can pick up from internal information. And as we're making that decision process, deciding whether or not to believe either ourselves and our own memory and trust that memory, or to believe other people, we use these cues, these source cues, to figure out how real does this memory seem to us. So is it something that I have a lot of details about? Is it something that contradicts other information I know to be true? Is it from a source that I perceive to be credible? These are all things that you ask yourself as you're trying to determine whether or not any information is true. And I think if you rehearse it enough and you want to believe it, I think you can decrease your sensitivity to certain cues. So you might think that memory is a little bit foggy to me, but then you could come up with reasons why it might be true, why that memory could still be true, even though it's a little bit foggy to you. Or you've repeated it so many times, you've come up with great details. That's what I did in my study. I had them use certain techniques that would lead to a good memory. So the lie becomes a good memory. It becomes that has a lot of details. It has one that has time cues. I would ask them, to think of what they were doing before and after the event, to connect it with their own history, use familiar names and places, and really just have a rich, detailed memory, which is often what we use to determine if something is true or false. We also like to think of the cognitive techniques that were used. So if I remember clearly an event, but I also remember that I know I lied about that event, I'm going to have a clear memory, but I'm also going to have an awareness for the cognitive operations that went into creating that memory. So I may have a memory of it, but I could also then say, I'm not going to believe that this is true because I know I made it up. I might even know why I made it up, or to who I made it up, or for what purpose. So all of these different cues go into whether or not the memory will be believable. So repetition causes familiarity, it causes increase in details. That's something that if you want someone to believe something, you just keep making them repeat it over and over again and get it to the point where that memory is really fluid for them, really easy to pull it out. And if you want someone else to believe you, you want to be a credible source. So you want to be a person who's generally believable. You want to blend truth and fiction together so that they have parts of it that they can hold on to. Those are the most pernicious lies, right? Those that sound right, and then you add little details in that aren't quite right. But if they're not obvious or they're not blatant, they may not pick up on that information. And if you come out and say something that's totally contradictory, people don't believe it. But if you kind of slide it in there and add it to a story that's already believable, but don't make it too obvious, right, that information will kind of just go along with the rest of it. And over time, it'll just seem true. It'll be with the rest of it and they won't notice it. So there's these kind of sneaky tricks you can use to trick yourself, to trick other people, to be tricked. And I think the more you know about those things, the better liar you probably can be. And in my study, I found that those who lied more often actually were the ones more likely to believe it. So,
you know, one of the things that stood out to me so much and throughout the research is the degree to which those liars come to believe the things that they have been lying about. In the paper you wrote, falsely assenting to events that have not happened increased the liar's belief in those events, which is as you had been describing. And you cited some previous research that said, through repetition, the content of the lie is strengthened, the truth is inhibited, and the lie may in fact be confused with the truth. So that sounds an awful lot like some of the things we're experiencing in real life here right now at a pretty substantial scale. And as you said, Babak, amplified by platforms that make that go faster potentially. And we're going to talk about that. So we know that repeated lies in news articles can become adopted as truth. You've talked about that. And that our brains can misattribute the source. And sometimes, as you said, you found in your research, they attribute that source sometimes to something more credible than where they originally found it. Their brain fills it in. And we also know that if we repeat those lies again and again, we come to adopt them even more deeply. This feels like a lot like what we're hearing in this kind of crisis of disinformation. When we talk about anti-vaxxers, we talk about conspiracy theories that are built out of things that people are familiar with, that seem convenient, that are assembled not from outlandish things initially, but actually from things that look reasonable, that are fit together in just the right or wrong way. And obviously, the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th believed whatever lie they were carrying deeply enough to go to Washington. They eventually became to believe the lies they were told, and the lies that they go on to tell others, in part because they've been telling them to themselves. Why does it work this way? What is it that allows this to happen in these larger groups and first individually and in these larger groups? Why does this happen to our brains?
Is that directed to me?
Sure. Yeah, and I think Babak, you've got some insights perhaps to offer around the ways it happens in groups online. So would love for you to join in after. Yeah.
I mean, I think you're getting at an issue that's a really huge issue that we don't know what truth is. A lot of times we don't know what the truth is, and the truth may not be what we think it is. It may not be what our adversaries think it is. It may not be who our polar opposites politically think it is. It might be somewhere in between. We may not have the whole bit of information at all. And the problem is most of the lie research and the memory research that I'm looking at, it's information you're trying to trick people into thinking they did things that they hadn't done, or they didn't do things they had done. In all of this information about politics and anti-vaxxers, we're not talking about firsthand experience. We're talking about information that they've been told from other people. And for your average person, we don't have access to information on vaccinations. We don't know what information is out there. And the information we have is what we think is out there. So we are basing information on the knowledge we currently have, which could be incomplete, it could be wrong. And we have to just trust doctors, we have to trust the news, whatever source we're getting that information from, it's not information that we're getting firsthand experience. Some people do have firsthand experience, so some people have adverse reactions to the vaccine, and then that further strengthens their opinion that the vaccinations are bad, right? Another person who had a good experience with a vaccination may further think like, I'm so glad I got this vaccine because my brother got sick and I didn't. So your experience can add to this, but basically what it comes down to, and why I think the disinformation is so prolific right now, is because people do not trust the sources anymore. It used to be that news sources were totally reliable. If you turned on CNN or Fox News or whatever you watched, you kind of were getting the same story from both sides. What you see now is you can turn on one news story and hear a completely different version of the same event And both are considered experts by the people who watch those shows. And so what's happening is you're getting source credibility is completely determining the information that you're believing. But interestingly, if you look at why people believe a certain source, it's often because that person espouses beliefs that already supports the person's pre-existing opinions. So a person who watches CNN might think CNN is the only reliable news source because everything they hear on CNN goes according to their preconceived beliefs. Whereas a person in Fox News will totally believe everything on Fox News because it fits into their narrative of what they believe. And there's been studies looking at this. There's a study, I think it was Kahan, 2011 et al. I don't remember the other authors' names. And they had a person who was considered a weather expert, and they were looking at global warming. And they gave participants the same description. It was supposed to be a researcher, I think, who got her Ph.D., his or her Ph.D. from Harvard, was working at like MAT, sounded like a really reliable source. But for half the participants, they were told that this person believed that humans were causing climate change. And the other half were told that this researcher believes that that claim is too premature. Well, interestingly, if you looked at their political affiliation, they rated the credibility of that researcher completely different based on what they said. If they agreed with climate change and they happened to be kind of a liberal Democrat, they really rated that person as a highly credible source. If they believed in climate change caused by humans, but they were kind of right-wing Republican, they completely discredited the reliability of this expert. So you have the same exact person being as credible by half your population, as completely non-credible by the other half, just depending on what they say. And that's the problem we're in right now, is that credibility is being determined on opinion. And we don't know where to go. People are at a loss for where they can find credible information. People don't know how to find this information themselves. I mean, I can look up studies in Medline or something online, and I can look at what they're saying about it because I have access to that. But I'm not your average person who has access to medical journals or other kind of thing. Your average person just is what they hear. And if they agree with it, they'll consider it a credible source. If not, they'll just discredit it. So what we're running into the problem is that the source of all of the information is being discredited by people who disagree with what they're saying. And our belief in the accuracy of news is at an all-time low. Media has such low, and same with our government. People just don't trust news anymore. They don't trust the government. And then you're left with social media. So
well, that's
people go online to
perfect,
see what their aunt and what their friends are saying. And we know that we all pick friends who tend to agree with us also. So we have social media echo chambers. We watch the news that validates our own opinions. And hence, we are in a huge issue where everyone thinks someone saying something different than them is disinformation. So it's a really sticky situation, because the more you believe and the more you know and the more you hear, the more you're validated in your opinion, and the more you'll seek to be credited, the more you'll seek to be validated, and you get more and more polarized, which is, I think, where we are now, which is a really dangerous place to be.
I think that's a great segue for me to head over to Babak. You've used machine learning to look at how people engage with information and discourse in online spaces, and speaking to Danielle's earlier comments about the way people accept or reject things that they find online. I think, imagine hearing the speaker, the expert, watching the news, and then going to those online groups, whether it's a Facebook group or Reddit, r/whatever. You've looked at evidence and values-based discussions and how they vary in the online discourse. And I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about how do those platforms then impact that discourse when people take what they've heard online, or when they find things there in their group engagements. What have you seen in your own research?
Yeah, I think this connects well to the ideas that were just discussed, because I think particularly because we're limited in the amount of information that we can incorporate into our decisions, we have to rely on our communities to supply us with ways of thinking. And one thing that has been really highlighted in my social media research is how easily methods for simplifying issues spread online and within the discourse. In particular, we look at the kinds of arguments that people provide and the kinds of evidence that they provide. With respect to arguments, you can think of two broad classes of arguments. One is based on my values, for example, we looked at same-sex marriage. My religion forbids same-sex marriage. That is value-based. Compare that with a consequence-based argument like same-sex marriage would help the economy. Really, the meat of the discourse is in the consequences, but values are much easier to talk about. I just say, I believe in X, and as a result, therefore, same-sex marriage should not be legalized. And what we saw was that before majority support for same-sex marriage was reached, people were talking more and more about their values. But once the decision was essentially made in 2012, only then they were like, well, this seems to be happening now. We need to talk about the stickier consequences. And kind of a similar thing is happening in marijuana legalization discourse with respect to the kind of evidence that people use. Again, you could think of anecdotal evidence, like my cousin got jailed for weed and ruined his life, or as opposed to here is what they found in a clinical study to be the effects of marijuana. And really, the meat of the discourse would be internalized arguments. But what we see is that, especially ahead of successful legalization ballot initiatives, there's a big increase in anecdotal discourse, where people are sharing these anecdotes. So again, I think the role of these anecdotes is to simplify the issue both for the speaker and the listener to more easily make a decision. But there's a danger in there, because then anecdote could very well not be generalizable. It could be presenting the exception rather than the rule. And there's another worry that I am looking at in a different area of my research, which is that anecdotes are easier for bots online to produce than generalized arguments. So very soon we might have our online spaces flooded with fake anecdotes in a way that might not happen for a few more years at least for more generalized arguments. So I think that is partly how this discourse has become kind of subverted. We are talking in terms of information in less substantive ways, but in ways that are more contagious and more easily spread online.
Before we leave this topic of discourse, I want to come back to you both. One of your other pieces of research, you talked about sort of community-related mechanisms that can harm the discourse. So not just not trusting the speaker, but actually sort of thinking you know more than you actually do about the community you're judging. I think a lot of our listeners would be familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, where individuals with low ability overestimate their ability. But your research also looked at how sort of community groups make this even worse, this what you called the misguided sense of others in one of your papers, this concept of how it impacts discourse and consensus building. Can you talk a little bit about what those assumptions and what you've seen online in this misguided sense of others concept?
Yes. Well, what we've found, and a lot of other researchers have found, is that the relation between individual knowledge and beliefs and the accuracy of beliefs is complicated, to say the least. What's more straightforward is the relation between our perceived sense of understanding and how strong our beliefs are. And our sense of understanding is lots of times affected by how well we think people in our community understand things. The problem is that lots of times this can quickly become a house of cards. I think that I understand something because I think others understand it, and others think they understand something because they think I understand it. And we have studied this in the context of Korean reunification, the attitudes in South Korea towards this issue, and at least in that area, it seems to be causing a lot of polarization. But we have also looked at the kind of mechanisms that can produce this type of result. For example, in what I've discovered and called the label entrenchment effect, and it's this idea that lots of times, especially when we're talking about things that we don't know much about, we substitute common usage of a label for its informational value. So we say, if people in my community use a particular term a lot, that means it has more value as an explanation. And our experimental results show why this can be dangerous, because you can give people labels that are transparently useless. There is no information at all in them. And as long as the community commonly uses them, people feel like they are explanatory. And it's because we have this kind of quick and dirty rules of thumb for figuring out what I do not know, but I have access to in my community, that can help me better know what information is out there. And I can give an example of what I mean by circular. Imagine I tell you there are stars that have variable brightness, and I tell you there's nothing else that is known about them, but they are commonly called coronary stars. And then if you come across a star that has variable brightness, and you ask me, why does this star have variable brightness? And I say, because it's a coronary star. This is completely circular. Coronary star just means has variable brightness, but as long as the label is commonly used, people feel like it's a better explanation. And we showed that even mental health experts, when they're thinking about mental disorder categories that have been debunked, can fall prey to this kind of thinking, where they confuse the common usage of a label with its actual informational value. And you can imagine how much more dangerous this can become in online discourse, because bad actors can have 1,000 bots post a term that they coined under 1,000 comments, and all of a sudden a word that most of the people don't even know what it means because, gains currency and gains informational value. And this is, for example, one of the ways in which new concepts, pseudoscientific concepts, can spread online.
Well, I think this is the point in the conversation where I become kind of sad for our future, because what I'm hearing is our brains are easily fooled. When we lie, we can fool others and even ourselves, and kind of rewrite the truth in our own brains. Repetition can be used to make us believe fake news and share it widely. We make assumptions about people online. We mistrust the people that we find, and we are susceptible to things like labels in order to, accept meaningless definitions, or even meaningful but negative definitions that we're presented with. So I guess my question to both of you is there anything we can do about it? What are some of the things that you know or have learned through your research, or that you have read in your own work, that are meaningful interventions or things that can make us more resilient? What are some of the things that we can do about this?
I can speak to that. I think one of the things that in the same research we found was that, at least with experts, if you bring their attention to the fact that they're using the entrenchment of the label by mistake as its informational value, they can correct course and do that damage. So I think just knowing about the kinds of mental shortcuts that we make can make us be more wary of abusing them, or using those shortcuts in places where they should not be used. So for example, just knowing that these labels have this effect might make someone stop for a few seconds next time and say, do I actually know what this term means? Do experts actually know what this term means? And that can also prevent other people who know about these cognitive properties to abuse them. And a similar thing from my social media research would be that, for example, when we know that anecdotes can be so persuasive, but can also be deceptive, we could always be on the lookout for people who use just anecdotes to persuade us. And we can always ask for what is the generalized argument? What is this instance an instance of? So I don't think these are things that we cannot overcome, but these are techniques that the population has to be more trained in. And I think there also needs to be more monitoring of these social media spaces by the stakeholders, by the policymakers, by the NGOs, etc., to notice these kinds of trends and to step in with these kinds of counteracting cognitive mechanisms. That would be my suggestion for what can be done.
Thank you. Dr. Polage, I mean, you've been, I was reading your paper on fake news and realized that at the time you wrote it, fake news didn't mean the same thing that it means today. You've had a lot of experience in this space, and I'm really curious, especially when you think about both the liars and the lied to, what are some of the things that we can do to intervene or to make people more resilient?
I think one of the most important things to resist falling prey to fake news and disinformation is to increase your knowledge base in the topic that you're talking about. That Pennycook study that I had mentioned earlier, where there were statements, some of which were clearly false, when there were things like the earth is a perfect square, repeating that over and over again did not increase their belief in those statements, even when they saw them multiple times. So if there's an obvious contradiction to knowledge base, people won't fall prey to that. The problem is most people don't have a knowledge base in a lot of the topics that they decide to talk about. A lot of people, especially people online who are arguing with their friends and stuff about politics, probably know very little bit about the topic. So my first advice would be to be more well-read on any topic that you would like to have discourse on, and avoid falling prey to some of these techniques is a knowledge base. That's something a person can do. I also think that when you're hearing information, before you decide whether or not you agree with it or whether or not you're going to decide whether the source is accurate, think about how you would feel if someone on the opposite side of the spectrum said that same exact topic. There's been some studies shown that they looked at statements that were attributed to Trump or not attributed to anyone, and people who were strong Republicans, if Trump said it, believed it. But the same idea, if someone else said it, they were less likely to. Similarly, Democrats, if they knew Trump said it, they wouldn't believe it. So again, I'm coming back to the issue of source because I think it's so important that sometimes we need to know who the source is, and then we base the credibility of the statement based on the source. But sometimes we need to think in reverse. We need to think, if someone I completely agreed with said this, would I be as opposed to that information as if someone who I disagreed with said it? So it can work both directions. I think being open-minded and not just agreeing with people we agree with generally is a great idea. I think politicians and the media need to also do this. They need to stand up for truth, even when it goes against the narrative that they're hoping to perpetuate. I think if we could see, Democrats coming together with Republicans on topics that they wouldn't normally agree on, I think it would restore our faith kind of in the system. And then people would be more likely to believe something from someone who tells the truth at all times and isn't only just feeding into the story that they're trying to sell. I think the source is really, really important. And we need to know credible outlets. I think people need to be able to look at information that was found online, and before reposting it, find out where did this come from, and check it out online. There's a lot of good sources that you can look to see independent people who have tried to evaluate the truthfulness of that, and not to perpetuate things if you don't know where they came from. So I think preventing information from being repeated if you don't know if it's accurate is another great tip, especially for people who are on social media. A lot of people repost things and you talk to them and find that they didn't even read the article. So they definitely don't know where it came from. So those would be some of my suggestions. Evaluating the source, getting your own deep knowledge base in the topic, and really not talking about things that you don't know very much about and spreading information but don't know to be true.
That's great. Thank you. And you've led me into the platforms, which is my second last question. Dr. Polage, in one of your papers you wrote, these results don't suggest that liars become fully convinced of their lies, but instead suggest an eroding of belief, which could increase as the number of times they lie increases. And I'm interested in hearing from each of you in this idea of erosion and enforcement or reinforcement. Do you think it's possible that social media has the potential to prompt this sort of stating of lies and sharing of lies at a higher rate because it's different than your normal daily human interaction? You have so many more people in your network, so much more constantly prompted by the apps. Do you think it's possible that social media plays a role in amplifying that potential for reinforcement and a deeper entrenchment of those lies in our cognitive reality?
I definitely think it plays a role, because I think a lot of people, I don't remember the number of hours, but I looked it up when I was writing the paper, how many hours people spend on social media. It's where they're getting the majority of their information from. On the other hand, I don't know if I believe that platforms such as Facebook and Twitter and all of those should be responsible for the content that are on there. I believe in freedom of speech, and I believe that people need to think both sides of the issue. And I feel that only with free, open discourse can you actually sometimes get to the truth. I don't think having our media kind of filtered through and only tell us what they believe is the answer. In research, if I wanted to write an introduction section to a paper and I wanted to kind of support one side of the argument, I have to read a variety of studies, some of which show the effect that I'm looking for. Some of them didn't find it. Some of them show the opposite. And as a researcher, I feel it's my job to kind of sift through the information and figure out how the methodology was different, look at the statistics myself, try to figure out kind of the whole story. But I don't think I'd get that if I only heard one side of the argument. So I'm not one for filtering out information. I do definitely think that Facebook has the potential to be very biased in what we read, because, I don't know if this is still true, but I had heard that, once you're clicking on something, it brings you more of the same topic instead of bringing you the opposite. I think that would be really interesting. So if you're searching for one side of the argument, I think it'd be cool if they not only gave you more information that's similar, which I know they're trying to, sell things. If you search for something, they're going to give you lots of links to something similar. But I also think it would be great if they threw in some, opposite side of the ideology for the topic, so you can kind of read both sides of the argument and have that discourse instead of just being fed one side of it. So I do think they are a big part of the problem, but I don't think kind of forcing them to be the information police is the way to go, at least not in my opinion.
Babak, what's your sense of the role of amplification or extension that you see in online communities through your work?
Well, one thing that I'm particularly worried about, and I briefly mentioned this earlier, is that it's much easier for non-human actors and agents to present themselves as part of the discourse online, and that actually undermines the kind of free exchange of ideas that was just being discussed, because I've been studying text generating algorithms, and even between 2019 and 2020, there has been a massive reduction in the difference between the quality of a human writing and the quality of the writing of a computer. But now a human can write, one comment in perhaps like a minute, but that algorithm can write a million comments in a minute. So it can, you know, the flood, if the floodgates open and if the platforms don't really crack down on this kind of behavior, you can end up with a situation where it seems like there are many people with a particular opinion, but it's actually a few actors with the technical know-how who are, spreading this data everywhere. So I think the good news is that based on my research, the algorithms aren't there yet. We humans still with enough attention can tell artificial text apart from human text, but I think within a year or two they would be, and that is certainly something that we should hold the platforms responsible for, because if we start wondering if everybody we have a conversation with online is a computer, then I think the whole discourse breaks down, because then even the truth when shared online can be assumed to be, coming from a bot that is paid for by, a cabal, and then with the full breakdown of discourse, we would be left with nowhere to go.
So in an hour, we've gone from we tend to trust everything that we hear at first to a world where we may trust nothing that we find, even when it's true. Last question for each of you. As I said off the top, these discussions are meant to inform the commission and help them focus their attention on the places they can have the greatest impact with some potential recommendations. So considering your expertise in the psychological and cognitive impacts mis and disinformation can have and the tactics that can be employed against individuals and groups, are there things that you would recommend or advise the commission to think about or focus on as they go into the next phase of their work through the balance of the summer? Danielle, do you want to kick us off?
I think the whole bot issue is really interesting, something I haven't given a lot of thought to, but I definitely know that the research shows that if people feel that they are in the minority, they're more likely to swing and kind of go over the other side. So I think on the technical side, that ability to stop the robot and computer interaction would be a great place to start, because I think humans should have free ideas and each person should be represented one time for each person, but definitely it wouldn't level the playing field if you had one person controlling a robot or just a bot using learning theory, putting out millions and millions of opinions that look like the whole world believes one way when really it's not. So I think that's a really important part. But as I said, I really think, I don't know how to get the information out there about credible sources, but I really think the source is something that needs to be something that is really important, because from a user's perspective, if I don't know information about a topic, where do I go? I go online and I try to do research. And if the information I'm finding is inaccurate, my beliefs are going to be inaccurate. If I'm being lied to all the time by the information I am reading, that's what I'm going to believe. So I think the information sources need to be credible. I think there needs to be an emphasis on data-driven decisions and transparency. I think transparency is very important. I mean, I've been disappointed that I don't think the vaccination, you're talking about anti-vaxxers earlier. I've been disappointed that the information about the vaccine has been focusing basically on bribing people with free donuts and limiting their freedom if you don't get one, instead of presenting data. Like, data is the way to get people to make decisions. And I think often data is hidden from the population. The government data is hidden. I think the media isn't providing appropriate data. I think transparency is something that needs, and let the data speak for itself. And, you know, in research, we're now going to kind of this open platform where we have to present our hypotheses and present all our data, and we have to put everything out there so a person reading the study can make a decision if they think that the methodology is sound and if the statistics were appropriate. For me, I'm a data junkie. I want more information, and my access to information on stuff I know about and I'm a expert on is obviously pretty good, but there's lots of things that I'd like to know about that I don't know enough about, and I don't even know sometimes where to go to look for good information. So transparency for me, good sourcing, increasing knowledge base, and controlling bots online, to me would be, that's where I would go if that was my goal, to prevent disinformation and to increase people's literacy.
Thank you. Babak?
I think one thing that I've seen in all of the research done on social media discourse is that whenever there's been a major change in discourse, whenever there's been change in attitudes, when there's been polarization, there's been consensus building, there are profound shifts in discourse. And these are things that the stakeholders can monitor better. You know, these are things that right now, especially with machine learning methods, we can do at a scale and at a level of detail that would be of interest to the public and would be of interest to psychological scientists. So I think one direction to go in would be a better use of these methods for tracking discourse, because at this point, we can predict for a lot of topics in which direction things are going. And the other thing is to make a better use of these psychological principles in policymaking, in designing information campaigns, and in even kind of like individual trainings, because these are things that the social media companies, for example, are already making use of. You know, one of the major employers of cognitive science, recent cognitive science graduates are these big media companies like Facebook. And they are applying these methods, but I don't think we are applying them to the same degree when you know, people in Washington, D.C. are trying to make decisions, or when NGOs are trying to evaluate how to frame their advertisement to reach their intended audience. So I think this is kind of the same idea of being data-driven, just at a more institutional, a more societal scale. That would be my main recommendation.
That's great. Thank you so much to both of you for spending the time. Thank you for your work. It's incredibly compelling and important work that you're both doing. It was really a pleasure to get to go through it and then to be able to ask you questions about it. So I appreciate that very much. This is all the time we have. And so I just want to say thanks again and look forward to a chance to chat with you perhaps again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. This was a great conversation. Really appreciated the question.